In Western Europe, absolute monarchy gained ground during the Middle Ages. Absolute monarchs would derive their power from two prime groups of the upper class, the aristocracy and the nobility. The aristocracy of the time controlled much of the wealth and commerce, while the nobility was generally in charge of wars and national security. The divine right of the kings was the principal guiding factor in the power of absolute monarchy.
It was only in the 17th century that we find the absolutist monarchies actually evolving in the East. Absolutism naturally did not take the same path in the East as it did in the West. That was primarily because of the weakness of the towns, the enslavement of the peasantry, and we find that the nobility also lacked the character that the nobility in West Europe had. But we find that though this nobility was unused to the discipline of an hierarchical society as you find in feudalism, yet confronted with many problems like the desertion of the peasantry, like foreign conquests, etc., they chose to side with an absolutist state. In Russia, from the early modern period onwards, we find the growth of the Tsarist regime or the Tsarist power, and this involved the conversion of allodial lands into conditional tenures. For the first time, we find that land was given in exchange for knight services, as you've already seen in the West. What later emerged as Russia did not have a kind of a Russian entity before. In fact, Russia emerged out of what was known as Muscovy.
Before 1300, Moscow was an insignificant city dwarfed by larger neighbors. Its true importance was illustrated by Alexander Nevsky, who left it to the youngest of the 13 sons, Daniel. Daniel proved to be a more than competent leader. When Daniel's reign ended in 1303, he left his heirs a principality that was twice as big as when he had ascended the throne. It was under Prince Dmitry Donsky that Moscow became strong enough to do what was unthinkable: fight the Mongols and win.
Until the 14th century, Muscovy was actually under the Golden Hordes, and it was divided into principalities which were called appanages. We find city republics also, like Novgorod and Vyatka in the north and the east, and Pskov and Kazan in the southwest and the southeast. The Imperial Republic of Poland lay to the west. During the 16th and the 17th century, we find migration right to the Pacific Ocean because there was actually no barriers in Russia. And we find that the rivers that were there in Russia, they did not act as barriers, but they in fact helped in this process of migration. The protection of these states were by a semi-military group who were called the Cossacks. Of the Muscovite state was brought about by territorial expansion, the absorption of the appanages or the principalities that we spoke about, and the surrounding republics, absorption of that into Muscovy, the social restructuring of the place, the establishment of the gentry service and re-inserfment. Peter the Great was to build the foundation, or was to build that kind of a state on which was based absolutism.
In Moscow, the prince ruled with the help of Boyar Duma, a council of aristocrats called boyars. The government in Old Muscovy represented a partnership between the prince and the nobles for the economic exploitation of the country. Decisions of the state were made by the prince and confirmed by Boyar Duma. In addition, a number of prikazi developed. These were usually headed by a boyar. Their work was supervised by Boyar Duma.
The boyar was the master of his estate. He collected taxes, administered justice, and governed the peasants virtually like serfs. The peasants were obliged to pay to the overlord labor services, which was called the barschina, and the obrok. The obrok was rent in money or in kind, just as the serfs did in Western Europe. But one very interesting aspect of the serfs or the peasants in Russia was this, that on one day, that is 26th November, which was called St. George's Day, the peasants could leave their masters if they so pleased. So this resulted in desertion of the peasantry from their boyar masters.
The boyars enjoyed privileges conferred on them by the prince. They also occupied the highest state offices and supplied the top officers in the prince's army. The Boyar Duma had the traditional right to advise the prince, but no legal or constitutional right beyond that. So the prince was free to choose his own course.
And we also find that after the decline of Kiev, there were numerous princes to whom the boyars attached themselves. And they attached themselves according to their desires and wishes. If they wanted to, switch from one prince to another, they could do so. Now, it was based on their will that they switched allegiance from one prince to the other. This new Russia was different from the West because in religion it was Orthodox, and where its script was concerned, the alphabet that it wrote was Greek. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Russia in fact wanted to take the place of Constantinople, and that is why at times Russia is called the Third Rome. We find that after Vasily, in fact, the most important work of really trying to unite the disparate groups into what eventually emerged into the Russian state was taken up by Ivan III, who created a viable Russian state.
Ivan III, popularly known as Ivan the Great, forged unification of Russia under Muscovite authority. He succeeded in ending the Mongol domination and transformed his government into an absolute monarchy. Ivan married the niece of the Byzantine emperor. The marriage made Ivan heir to what was left of Constantinople. The church invented a remarkable genealogy for Ivan that traced his lineage back to the brother of Caesar. Ivan bequeathed to his son Vasily III a great nation covering 55,000 square miles, 110 times the size of the fief that Alexander Nevsky had given Daniel more than 200 years ago. The next Tsar, Vasily III, was too colorless compared to his father, but he completed the work of reunification that his father had started.
We find that Vasily annexed Pskov and Ryazan and captured Smolensk, which is very important because Smolensk was the gateway to the west. And next we find Ivan IV, who was called Ivan the Terrible. And it was under Ivan the Terrible that the expansion of Russia continued.
Ivan IV succeeded his father Vasily III and was the first Grand Prince to have himself officially crowned the Tsar.
So the title Tsar was fashioned on the word Caesar.
During his reign, Russia became a fully autocratic state. He ascended the throne at the age of 3. Regents ruled for him until he was crowned Tsar at the age of 16. He also married Anastasia, who was a member of the Romanov Boyar family. Ivan IV's reign is usually divided into 2 parts. During the first half, Ivan IV ruled with the advice of a council. Finding the boyars untrustworthy, Ivan created a new nobility that was the service gentry. The officers of the service gentry were given small to medium-sized estates as a reward for their services. Since the Tsar could give or take away their lands at the drop of a hat, the service gentry remained loyal to him, and he used them as a check against hereditary nobility. Ivan IV formed an assembly of the land, the Zemsky Sobor, that consisted of the service gentry, the clergy, the merchants, and a few loyal boyars. It was not a true parliament in the Western sense. Its members were appointed, not elected, and it was meant to approve the Tsar's proposals. Still, Ivan listened carefully to the grievances and took steps to remedy the causes of some of them.
Between 1560 and 63, however, the Council of Advisors of Ivan IV lost its power, and in 1564 we find that Ivan abdicates. He goes away on his own because he could not manage or control the situation. The city begged him to come back because they realized that he was the lesser of the 2 evils. Once he returns, he comes back on his own terms, and then he initiates a period of severe punishment to all those who believed, who had intrigued against him and deposed him. This, of course, is a period of extremity in Russia, but no one actually opposed that because they realized that he was a better guarantee against outside encroachments and foreign invasions.
During the second half of his reign, Ivan IV often disregarded the Council of Advisors. He gained the authority to rule with complete autonomy. Thus, he earned himself the name Ivan the Terrible. Russia was divided into 2 areas. In the region known as Oprichnina, Ivan IV had sole control. In the other, Boyar Duma was to have complete control, but this agreement was never carried out. He used Oprichniki, a militia that was loyal to him, to terrorize the entire nation. Ivan was paranoid and prone to mood swings. One day, in a fit of rage, he killed his eldest son with a blow to the head.
death of Ivan was followed by internal troubles, which culminated in the time of troubles, which is the period 1610 and 1613. But from 1584 to 1605, we find Boris Godunov, who was the brother-in-law of the new Tsar, ruled, and two important things happened during this time, and that is why we mention the name of Godunov. One is that in 1590, the Orthodox Church of Russia became autonomous, very, very important. It had its own patriarch. The Orthodox Church was very different from the Catholic Church and equal to those of Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem and Alexandria. And in 1597, the peasants were attached to the land and re-enserved. Two very important events, one ecclesiastical, religious, the other secular. After the death of Godunov, we find a civil war followed. There was foreign invasion. The Poles occupied Moscow. The Swedes seized Novgorod, while the boyars and the Cossacks revolted. Obviously, the thing is, they were unused to a unified state under central command. So, when the opportunity came, they all rebelled and revolted, and the foreign powers, they came and started asserting their themselves on Russian soil. The middle class got alarmed because they felt that the newly emerging or the nascent Russian state would disintegrate, and we find that they sort of brought, or they in fact voluntarily chose a distant relative of Ivan the Terrible as Tsar, and under Michael Romanov and his son Alexei, the Russians recovered. That is, they slowly recovered the lost ground, and eventually you find the formation of a unified Russian state. The strong rulers who succeeded Ivan III further expanded the kingdom either by conquest or by agreement, and also by agricultural extension and settlement. So here you have internal homogenization. That is, after the conquest, charters were given to the conquered territories. The Boyar Duma imposed Muscovite laws in these new territories, and instead of salaries, we find the system of kormleni. The kormleni was practiced. That is, instead of salaries, you would be given land. So, you find that the new territories which were being conquered, they did not remain alienated. Here, the Russian laws were imposed. Here, Russians were settled. And here, you find there was this, agriculture was extended into these places. And you find the process of homogenization, where you find a kind of a Russian entity was, sort of injected into these places.
পশ্চিম ইউরোপে যে ক্ষেত্রে আমরা দেখেছি যে রাজাকে সাহায্যকারী শ্রেণীর মধ্যে একটা গুরুত্বপূর্ণ স্থান অধিকার করেছিল পুঁজিবাদী গোষ্ঠীরা, মানে পুঁজিপতি গোষ্ঠীরা বা শহুরে পুঁজিপতিরা, কিন্তু রাশিয়ার ক্ষেত্রে কি সেরকম শহুরে পুঁজিপতি
না? If you're talking about the urban classes helping the ruling classes in Western Europe, that thing was not there in Russia. You have to realize that Russia or Muscovy, or what later emerged as Russia, it was a very disparate existence where you have different principalities, where you have, different groups, in fact, vying with one another to exert themselves. You do not have a kind of unified existence in Russia. And because of this political turmoil and chaos, you also do not have many towns emerging. So the question of an urban middle class, or not the middle class, the urban commercial class, in fact, helping the ruling class does not arise in Russia. The gentry, which had grown very prosperous because agriculture was expanding, supported the Tsars in their despotism and conquests. So we had seen how the boyars had opposed a centralized leadership. But the new emerging gentry class was the support base that the Tsars needed. Because they were the creation of this new regime, they obviously sided with the Tsars. They worked in tandem with the Tsars, colluded with the Tsars. The boyars was one of the pillars of the Muscovite state. We have seen the importance of, we now realized the importance of the boyars. And they were the nobility of service. But by the 16th century, they held their estates by right of votchina. Votchina is what? That the land would automatically go from father to son. It became hereditary. Once land becomes hereditary, it sort of becomes, you develop vested interest around the land. The land theoretically is the ruler's or someone else's, if it is someone else's, but in actuality, you act as the master of that area. By tradition, the prince was dependent upon his boyar for military service, and without his support he could not do much. But this feudal dependence did not accord with this new Muscovite absolutism, where if it's an absolutist state, then all allegiance has to be to the ruler. It cannot be to an intermediary. So if the boyars were attached to the prince, it meant that the princes were intermediaries between the ruler and the boyars. This could not be tolerated in an absolutist state because it goes against the spirit of absolutism. Now, in the 16th century, there emerged therefore a new tenure of landholding which was called the pomesty, which was a very significant development as far as the 16th century land tenure was concerned. This pomesty system spread all over, and we find the serving men were given lands, especially in the new territories. So the new territories that were acquired, men were allotted those new territories as the pomestai. Thus, there were different kinds of land settlements. We find the votchina, the pomesty, the monastic and the church lands, and of course, you also find serfdom. Now, the princes or the intermediaries that we are talking about in the Muscovite state were the princes who had a common blood with the ruler. They were the same stock. They were called the Nyazatas. And these princes, because they were of the same stock as the ruler, they of course were against absolutism. They also wanted to share power with the ruler. So they were against absolutism, and they were trying to promote a kind of a government which would be more oligarchic. It would be a kind of an alliance between the Nyazatas and the rulers, an oligarchic state. And of course, an absolutist monarch was not going to support the Nyazatas. So this was against the absolutist spirit of the state. The boyars, on the other hand, did not share the same origin as the Nyazatas. So it was these boyars who could be actually utilized by the rulers against the Nyazatas or the princes. And because of this friction between the boyars and the Nyazatas, because I had told you that the boyars, if they wanted to switch allegiance, they could do so of their own sweet will. They did not actually have to take the permission of anyone. And there was this constant friction between the Nyazatas and the boyars. And we find that a system came into place which was called, very important, it was called according to their lineage and family, which in Russian is местничество, and was according to this местничество was according to the standards set by the Tsar. So the relationship that we find, a kind of a relationship which emerged between the boyars and the Nyazata, was a relationship which was dependent on the way the Tsar wanted the relationship to emerge. Now, the dominance of the nobility was essential for the unification of Russia under the Muscovite absolutism. The reduction of the princes and the nobility, on the other hand, was also absolutely necessary. So to bring the state together, you needed their support. But if you want an out and out absolutist state, then you also have to limit the power of these nobles as well as the boyars and the princes.
পশ্চিম ইউরোপের ক্ষেত্রে সেনাবাহিনী তো স্টেট নিজের আন্ডারে রাখতো সম্পূর্ণ, আর ট্যাক্সেশনও একদম রাষ্ট্রের তরফ থেকে করা হতো, কিন্তু এখানে কি একটু ডিসেন্ট্রালাইজড?
When the process of unification started, the ruler really had to depend on the existing system. Only when he could, sort of create a kind of a united entity could he then start exerting himself. From the beginning, if he had sort of alienated both the boyars and the niyazatas, then what would have happened is this: they would have come together and posed a serious challenge to the authority of the absolutist monarch. Only when he was, progressing, or all the monarchs were progressing a step at a time. So only when they were able to maim one did they try to curb the activities of the other. And eventually during Ivan IV's time, you do have the emergence of new classes of people who were dependent directly on the absolutist monarch. During the time of Ivan IV, civil rebellions, we do not find civil rebellions. Neither do we find external aggression. It was only after Ivan IV's time, when we mentioned the time of troubles, that we find civil rebellion and foreign aggression. And this, of course, the people of Russia at that time realized. They realized that an absolutist state was the best guarantee against civil wars and against internal rebellions. They, in fact, invited, as we've already mentioned, a relative of Ivan IV to come and reimpose absolutism in Russia.
The Tsars of Russia were the longest ruling absolute monarchs. From the reign of Ivan the Terrible till Nicholas Romanov, whose reign ended with the Russian Revolution in 1905. After the American and French Revolution, absolute monarchy was slowly disbanded. By the time World War I was over, the rule of a single leader with divine rights had given way to democracy and nationalism.